So this is it, my true come to the dark side moment. That's right, I have come to the dark side. But look, they really did give us cookies. What's up, Internet? Jay here with Nerd Rage Against the Machine, and today we're going to talk Star Wars. Now, before we do, a little bit of housekeeping. I want to do a quick apology for not being around. I've been meaning to make more videos, but life has gotten in the way. Between a hospital stay, some other things in my life, just hasn't been my year. But, got new glasses. Hey. Ultimately, though, this is my first video, and it's going to be a longer video. And I hope you enjoy it, but I can also see where this is probably going to be the video that's going to piss a lot of fans off, especially with the takes that I have on the subject. But let's start at the beginning, start with some credentials. So I saw Star Wars all the way back in 1978. Now, put the keyboard down. I know it came out in 77, but my dad worked offshore and out of country a lot, and we went with him. So I was not in the country in 1977. We came back in 1978, and I saw Star Wars in a drive-thru. The first time within a couple weeks of coming back from Iran. Yes, that's right, Iran. And I hated it. I did not like it. But then again, I was also a jet-lagged 5-year-old child who was watching this weird thing on a drive-in screen half awake. Fell asleep during it, actually. Second time I saw it, though, I was hooked. I fell in love, and I've loved Star Wars ever since. I will admit that I am a bigger Star Trek fan, but I'm also not one of these people who believes in that kind of tribalism of, well, if you like Star Trek, then you have to hate Star Wars, or if you like Marvel, you have to hate DC. That's not how any of this works, guys, and you know it. So, to that end, I do love Star Wars, and I do see problems with the franchise. But I think that it's important to know where those problems actually lie and where they come from. And I think that there's a lot of people who have hot takes on this that are just, flat out wrong. So let me start this video with the first part, which is what's actually not wrong with Star Wars. So this first part of this video, and this is going to be a longer video, I'm gonna preface that right now. I want to talk about the things that people tend to think are wrong with Star Wars that really aren't. The first one, of course, being Kathleen Kennedy. If you're expecting a long-form attack on a Disney producer, hoping that she gets fired or worse, then this video is definitely not for you. And I know that there's some of you who've already gotten the keyboards out and are telling me that she's the worst person on earth, she's a terrible human being, blah, blah, blah. It's just not true. For one, all the cries of Kathleen Kennedy's ruined my childhood. I'm just going to say this. She started on films like Jurassic Park, The Goonies. If she was really dead set to ruin your childhood, she has been playing the long game, people. Sorry, it's just true. And what's more, the other big attack on her has always been the get woke, go broke argument, which does not hold a lot of water. And here's a couple examples as to why. Number one, let's talk about what Star Wars movie made the least amount of money in the theater. Don't Google it, but just guess. And I'm sure that there's guesses like Solo or Episode 9 or whatever. But the answer is Clone Wars. Why is it Clone Wars? Because it was an animated film, and a lot of people believe that animated films just aren't real entertainment. There are still people who believe that way. And it didn't have the advertising, the marketing, or really any of the draw that the mainline Star Wars films have had, or even the sublines like, Rogue One and the like. And ultimately, it was a matter of passion. Even those people who hate Star Wars and I'll never watch Star Wars again probably go to see them, which is why, pretty much all these sequels that everyone hates, still made a ton of money. On top of that, the Get Woke, Go Broke stuff, you know, you have people like The Quartering or Geeks and Gamers constantly giving us this. Kathleen Kennedy didn't invent this, nor did she spread it to other studios. Kathleen Kennedy is not the reason that Barbie was made. She's not the reason that Marvel went woke, or Disney went woke, if you will, or they went a different route with She-Ra. You know, it's a trend in the market, if anything. And to be fair, guys, let's look at one of Disney's biggest failings in the last 20 years. Dollars spent to dollars earned, it would be John Carter, a movie with a strong cis white male protagonist, but was just not a good movie. Nobody went to go see it. So, no, I don't believe that she is the immediate cause or even a direct cause to everything wrong with Star Wars, if we really want to go that route. The second one, and this is another big one, because I think this is going to be another keyboard warriors at the ready here, but that is, it's not the characters. I've heard a million times about what a terrible Mary Sue Ray is. She's the worst character ever written. She's the worst character ever designed, blah, 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 blah. No, sorry, guys. It's not the way this works. It's not the way any of this works. You know, one of the big arguments is, you know, we never see her train. We never see this. You know, we didn't see that with Luke either. What we got was a couple of throwaway lines. In the first movie, before the special edition, he mentions he's a good pilot. He mentions bullseyeing womp rats with his T-16 back home. But again, these are all pretty nebulous, and we have to accept them. Then we have Obi-Wan giving him a little bit of lightsaber training, and boom, next thing you know, he's the protagonist. You know, those same kind of throwaway lines could have been thrown into Episode 7, you know. I helped, I can't remember the name of the creature that she was bartering with, but I helped him to maintain the Falcon. Okay, cool. Or even I had to fly it on occasion. That's all it would have taken, and those arguments are gone. She used a staff, a lightsaber, you know, isn't terribly off. It's not the end of the world, but more than that, let me give you another perfect example of why it's not characters. A lot of times, even in writing, characters are there to serve a purpose. So this is going to be another part of this video that's going to piss people off, I'm sure, but let me just say this. Hot take that you're not going to like. Han Solo and Jar Jar Binks serve the same purposes in both their respective trilogies. Now, saying that, I want you to also keep in mind that these are both characters created by George Lucas, not by Kathleen Kennedy, not by anybody else. And the thing is that if you look at the first trilogy, you have Luke as the young apprentice, Obi-Wan as the old master, and Han, who is the doubting Thomas, the everyman who can tell us that this is all a load of crap, so that he can be amazed when it turns out not to be. Well, in Episode 1, we have Obi-Wan, the young apprentice, Qui-Gon, the old master, and Jar Jar, who, again, is the doubting Thomas everyman. Despite being a CGI alien, that's what he is. And even both characters have a line that expressly states this. Han says something along the lines of, you know, hokey religion and ancient superstitions are no use against a good blaster by your side, whereas Jar Jar goes with the, oh, massive is the Force. Both lines are pretty much trying to tell you that these guys don't buy into this stuff, which they will, of course, be proven wrong later. Now, these were both created by the same guy, but they were created by the same guy at different times in his life, as different people in some respects. Han Solo was created by a 30-something during, you know, the end of the Vietnam War, the depression that was in the 70s, the general malaise. Young, hungry filmmaker who's only had 2 films under his belt, and whose friends are all in that same kind of gritty, realistic movie-making ideal, such as, you know, the fact is, you know, he was supposed to direct Apocalypse Now. Coppola took it, but originally he was slated to do that because that's the kind of things they were making. And so you have a dark, you know, hard criminal character, whereas by the time 1998, 1999 rolls around, George is a parent. He's also the wealthiest entertainer in the world. and he's looking at a character that's more marketable. So yes, he makes a more friendly, cartoony character. But they serve the same purpose in the story. And I know that's a weird thing to think about, but it's true. So with those things in mind, the last one I want to bring up, and this one I'm actually going to target at a specific person, kind of, because I remember him complaining about this a lot, and I want to bring it up because I think it's kind of a funny one, and that is Tony from Analog Toys, who, during his review of Boba Fett, complained a lot about how people say that they always turn off their brains when they watch Star Wars, and he kind of, went on this whole thing about how he likes to critically think this stuff out, and that's wonderful, but I don't think the term shut your brain off is really what anyone means. What it comes down to is that Star Wars is, and always has been, a very pulpy science fiction series that is more about what looks cool on screen than what is totally and ultimately logical. Star Trek is definitely more realistic. Babylon 5 is more realistic. Other films are more realistic than Star Wars. I mean, and I'm not just saying that because of space wizards and laser swords either. All sorts of examples throughout the trilogy, even the first parts of the trilogy, show you huge leaps of logic. An example of this would be the TIE Fighter. So why is it that the cash-strapped, dirt-poor rebellion can build a fighter like this, with decent visual capability, hyperdrive, shields? Other than the gimmick of the wings popping up, this makes a lot of sense, logistically speaking, as far as a fighter goes. The Empire, super wealthy, resource-rich, instead build a pod, a circular pod that you climb in through the top of, with what is effectively a dryer, a clothing dryer port out. That's the only viewpoint you have. And then we're going to put two big-ass blinders on either side of that. No shields and no hyperdrive. What's the point of that? The only thing I can think of is that the Empire is really keen on the Zap Brannigan school of sending wave after wave after wave of enemies in hopes of destroying a better fighter. You would think that the Empire would at least start thinking early on, even, before Episode 4, about improvements, making a better fighter. They certainly have bigger schools, better schools to train pilots in than these cash-strapped rebels, but they never do it. You see the same thing in Episode 1. The amount of lack of handrails, the random force fields in the Naboo, in that Naboo hangar alone, it's like this thing, OSHA would have a field day there. But it looked cool on screen when those force fields randomly went up and you got to see, Darth Maul stalking back and forth like a rabid animal, whilst Obi-Wan is obviously apprehensive and Qui-Gon is, basically doing the meditation thing. It gave you an idea of what those characters are in a visual sense, but logically, why? I mean, what kind of place has random force fields and bottomless pits for no good reason? But again, it looked cool on film, and that's a lot of what happens. Tony from Analog Toys' gripes were specifically set on Boba Fett, so I want to address the three big ones. Number one, of course, why is it when Boba Fett was surrounded by all these guys with shields and pikes, didn't he just go, oh yeah, I got a jetpack, jump up and start blasting? Because it looked way cooler in somebody's mind to have, this become a big fight scene and to show off Fennec Shan's parkour abilities. Again, one of the reasons that we also see in the original Star Wars why Obi-Wan and Vader fight, traditional Budokan style, but by the time Episode 1 comes around, Darth Maul is throwing martial arts moves because, as much as you can argue that it was because, well, Vader's, in this suit and Obi-Wan's old, this is much because of the fact that cinema had changed in 20 years, and honestly, having a hardcore martial artist doing all that stuff looked way cooler on screen than dink, 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 dink did. Sorry, that's a lot of it. And you see that in the third trilogy as well. I mean, Rey jumps over Kylo Ren's fighter because that just looked cool. Regardless of her gender. If if it had been a guy Jedi, it would have looked just as cool. So again, this has always been a part of Star Wars. What looks cool trumps what is logical. And again, with Star Wars, the other point Tony made was, why is it that he didn't just get in Slave One and start blasting those droidicas at the end? Because, again, we had Chekhov's Rancor. We had, them introduce the Rancor, and we knew it wasn't just going to sit there in a basement under Jabba's palace, because also, kaiju sequences look cool. That's it. That's really what it comes down to, is this is the logic that has always been baked into Star Wars. Love it or hate it, it's baked into Star Wars. And the last one, of course, which I kind of agree with, was the goofy designs of the bikers. This one there actually is a little logic to, which is, I think, the fact that, again, anytime you have rebellious kids, gangs, they're going to try to stand out. Yes, the bikes look goofy. I'm not arguing that. But at the same time, plenty of people thought the hippies in the 1960s looked goofy, especially when everyone was wearing really short hair and belts and ties, and women wore outfits more like Donna Reed. But again, the freaks looked like freaks because they were trying to stand out. And that's, I think, the same thing here. It was an aesthetic choice, it was an artistic choice, not objectively wrong, but I could understand why you would not like it subjectively. To that end, let's get into some actual things that I think really do cause that kind of narrative dissonance that a lot of people feel in the franchise. Let's start with part 2 here. George Lucas. Now, this may sound like I'm going to blame Lucas for everything wrong with this series, and that's not the case. For one thing, you can't blame George Lucas for everything wrong with something that he created. He created a hell of a series. He created a hell of a story. And I think just simply blaming him for everything wrong with Star Wars is just as stupid as it is to blame Kennedy. But let's start with some basics here. Let's look at George before Star Wars. Lucas was a hot rodder who almost got killed in a car wreck from his own retelling of the story. Ended up going to UC Film School. He, along with others, helped to create what was known as the American New Wave, which is, very similar to the French New Wave. The idea that we now have this technology, which you're seeing right here on YouTube, that anybody can get cameras easily, anyone can get production equipment easily enough to make a movie a lot easier. So George did just that. He made 2 movies before Star Wars, THX 1138, which is an interesting science fiction movie that did okay. And again, was kind of esoteric, but not bad. Then he did American Graffiti, which was his first really successful film, and for a while was the most profitable film, dollars spent to dollars earned, of anything out there. Can't complain about that. So, we have, again, hot on the heels of that, he comes up with this idea for a Flash Gordon-like science fantasy series. King Features won't give him the rights to Flash Gordon, which was stupid on their end, but hey, that's okay. So he creates this entire world that he's definitely hyper about. And goes to Fox with the idea of making this movie. They have no interest, and it's obvious that he's wanting to make, a big thing of this. So he makes the first movie with Fox's, approval, or Fox's money, and keeps the rights to the movie. Now, once it becomes a success, and I mean a wild success, that's something a lot of people don't understand here, is what a wild success this was. I mean, the idea of a lot of sequels wasn't big in Hollywood. Yes, there are exceptions to rules. Bond, obviously, the Planet of the Apes movies, but, we didn't get a Breakfast at Tiffany's Part 2. We didn't get a Gone with the Wind Part 2. And, even counting Wizard of Oz, which has had a couple of sequels, starting with, Return to Oz in the 1980s, these weren't direct sequels. They weren't like Star Wars or movies today like Fast and the Furious or the like, where, they become a franchise. So, this was unique that we were going to make more movies. And I think, honestly, in this respect, George Lucas bit off a little more than he could chew. And again, I don't say this to attack the man. I don't say this to belittle the guy. But, he was very excited about this project, and, he had obviously worked on the idea of a sequel. The book Splinter in the Mind's Eye, which was written by Alan Dean Foster, was meant to be an outline for a sequel, should Fox basically give it the boot. And, well, when they didn't, of course, we went to Empire Strikes Back, which was a much bigger production. Saying that, Lucas immediately came up with this idea that we would have 9 movies. And this is how he explained it to everybody. This is one of 9 films. And because of that connection to Flash Gordon and the serials, and serials, yes, they did have a lot of sequels to serials, but that was because these serials were tiny throwaway movies at the beginning of a real movie. So, you might go see Wizard of Oz, and right before it, you might have seen a Captain Marvel short or Tom Mix or something, but these were not the main draw. Saying that these serials had, there was a good chance you were just going to walk in the middle of them, something you wouldn't do in a theatrical release. You weren't walking into the middle of a sequel of some movie normally. So, again, 9 films, with Star Wars, now called Star Wars A New Hope, was going to be episode 4 of which. Cool. So we have now 9 movies. Now think about this for just a second, guys. Here's a 30-year-old guy who has had one huge success under his belt, now has an even huger success under his belt. And in that huge success, he sees an entire, saga of films coming out. That's a big check to write. That's a big chunk of your life. If he had just barreled through, let's go with it this way. It took him about 3 years to make each of these movies. So Star Wars comes out in 77, Empire in 80, Jedi in 83. That means by 86 we would have seen the first prequel movie. Then the second would have been 89, 92 for the end of the prequel trilogy. And instead, he did the first 3 movies, right? Star Wars, Empire, Return. And then he stopped. He did other projects. He worked on Indiana Jones. He worked on Howard the Duck, Radioland Murders. Now, each to varying degrees of success. Willow, but none of these had the success that Star Wars had. So, with that promise of 9 movies, and I think everyone expected it, he, like I just did, had life get in the way. Things, he'd become a father at this point. He had other things on his mind. He was worried about, ILM and other issues in his life, and wanting other projects. I mean, again, Star Wars may have been a grand idea at that time in 1978, 77, 76, somewhere in there for him. But, that same time, he overextended himself. And we see this in other creators, too. The Wachowski siblings did the same thing with The Matrix. The first movie is pretty much a self-contained film. But they had a lot of background material. They had a lot of other things they wanted to do. So, as soon as that movie became such a surprise hit, it was almost immediately announced that the Wachowskis had always planned this to be a trilogy. I'm not sure I 100% buy that. And other movies, and we've seen this, look at other movies that were successes, that even if the director didn't say that, the studios wanted to milk it at that point because there's money to be made there. The Terminator comes to mind for that. So, yeah, Star Wars was going to go forward, at least for 2 more movies, if not more. But when Lucas gave that magic number of 9, that became kind of this fulfillment, this wish fulfillment that we had to have. We had to have our 9 movies, come hell or high water. So, he took a good time between Jedi and The Phantom Menace. And in that time, he as a person grew and changed. and so did we. This was, I think, the biggest thing that really affects Star Wars. It's not, corporate meddling. It's not the Disney buyout, but this. We have a guy who, like I said, was a young man who had this amazing idea, was going to make tons of these, and then got burned out after the first three, the first third of the 9-mile marathon. So now what? He gave it some time, and he experimented. Look at Shadows of the Empire. This is a pretty good example. So at the time that Shadows of the Empire came out, Star Wars books, and basically there was this kind of revitalized love of Star Wars happening at that point. And Lucas found that he could market and merchandise an entire story without a movie. I mean, we had a video game, we had a novel, we had comic books, we had a role-playing game, we had toys, t-shirts, everything. Everything that you would have seen in a movie release, but no movie. So from there, he goes on to make the special editions, which again were just basically him going through and saying, if I had the resources, money, and time that I wish I had when I made these, here's what I would have done different. And then, he pissed off a lot of fans almost immediately by saying, these are now Star Wars, and what we had before doesn't exist. And I could get into an argument here about, Lucas's complaints about colorization. Now we see the same thing when he's in a state of power, but we'll skip that for now and go on. Lucas made this change because it's what he could do, and it's what he wanted. So then he works on the prequels. And again, this is the big thing. The big thing that's changed Star Wars, the big problem Star Wars has had, is now time. And what I mean by that is, again, the 5-year-old child who watched Star Wars, or the 3-year-old child who watched it, or the 6-year-old who saw it on VHS 5 years later, who all fell in love with this movie, grew up. They changed. And part of that was that there was an expectation for what Star Wars was going to be. Here's what I want out of a prequel. Here's how I envision this saga going. And it's going to be massive. It's going to be huge. So George, who has also grown up and changed, he's a father now. He's he's one of the wealthiest entertainers in the world, just for owning things like THX and ILM. He comes back to Star Wars with a very different attitude, creating characters that are definitely more family-focused, definitely more family-friendly, and, the studios immediately jump on this. They all want a piece because, again, this is Star Wars. This is like the Beatles coming back together. It's such a huge nostalgia rush, plus, the continuation of something that we've all been told is the greatest thing ever. Who doesn't want a part of that? So, what happens? Well, George Lucas basically builds the first movie all by himself. No help, nobody telling him, nobody controlling him at all, which is kind of his big shtick at this point. He has the money, he has the resources to make this all by himself. And we've seen this happen before, where some of the greatest parts of Star Wars were those compromises. Some of Lucas's ideas for the original trilogy were terrible, but there was somebody there telling him, no, don't do that. Well, Phantom Menace didn't have that. It didn't. Love it or hate it, it didn't have that. And it suffered because of it. And it was a huge disappointment for many people, but, Lucas made 5 times the cost of making that film back just in merchandising. Much like his earlier work with Shadows of the Empire, he could have just said, no movie, psych, and still, made a profit. But he didn't. He made a movie. And it was an okay movie. But it wasn't a movie that could live up to the expectations of what we expected. It's what happens, especially when you have, this huge gap in time, and the director's changed, the creator's changed, and the audience has changed. Again, as a 5-year-old, oh my God, this was, I just watched Obi-Wan Kenobi cut off a walrus man's arm. Oh my God. But since then I've seen way worse on screen, way cooler stuff. So yeah, it's easy to see why, you're immediately not going to have the same reaction to another Star Wars film that you might have. And again, Lucas was more interested in merchandising and in telling a specific type of story. The next two movies, really, the big difference is that he did have feedback now. He had fan feedback. The one feedback he couldn't really ignore, like he could, studio executives who, again, were being paid by George Lucas, so they weren't going to be that likely to say, George, this idea is crap. So he went forward. And yes, fans did speak out. And that's what kind of evolved and changed certain things in the next two movies. Were they perfect? No. But even let's go back to Phantom Menace for a second. It wasn't a terrible movie. It was okay. It's just, again, consider where you expected it to be versus where it was. And this is the other part I want to make here about time, because time, I think, is the real issue here. Now, just as I was a 5-year-old kid when I first saw Star Wars, watched it, loved it, and then was 20-something when Episode 1 came out, and was more than willing to tell people that it was the stupidest thing I'd ever seen, and George Lucas ruined my childhood, which was exaggeration. Honestly, it's exaggeration. But, what I didn't think about at the time, and hindsight being 2020, is how many 5-year-old kids watched Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon, Queen Amidala, Jar Jar Binks, and were enthralled, were enraptured by what they'd seen. This was it. This was, I've got to see more. There's 3 more of these? Oh my God, yes, I want to watch them. And they grew up with the prequel trilogy the same way I grew up with the classic trilogy. This is kind of the MTV effect. And what I mean by that is, you see this with all sorts of things. Saturday Night Live, MTV, as I stated. And that is where, the young crowd has their version of something, and the older crowd will immediately talk about how it's not as good as it was in our day. Saturday Night Live is a perfect example. Take any season of Saturday Night Live, and you'll hear people gripe about how the show just has gone downhill. Who is this idiot, this Will Ferrell? My God, man. The show just has gone downhill. It isn't as good as when, Phil Hartman and Mike Myers were on it. And there were people at the time, Mike Myers and Phil Hartman, who the hell are these jackasses? This show wasn't as good as it was back when Eddie Murphy and Joe Piscopo were the main stars. And, of course, Murphy and Piscopo also got that who are these jackasses treatment, because they're not the original, not ready for primetime players. And with music, again, you see this with music. MTV used to be good in my day. Now it's all this crap music. And that not just MTV, but that's music in general, In my day, we had good music, I guess, but Star Wars falls in that same category. The sagas, the trilogies, they really are for the era that they're made for. Saying that, we move on to Lucas doing 3 more movies, doing some animated stuff. The animated stuff didn't sell as well. Again, there were diehards, don't get me wrong, who loved it. But there were a lot of people who also said, it's a cartoon, it doesn't count. That wasn't a prevailing mentality at the time. So Lucas gets the chance to sell Star Wars to Disney. And Disney does what Disney does. It buys Star Wars and it makes its own saga. Again, there's a time difference. And, you may remember that immediately after Episode 7 was announced, there were a lot of fans hopeful because, maybe they won't use CG. They're promising no CG. They've got a good director. Maybe they can get rid of all the things that Lucas screwed up. And again, I'm not here to blame Lucas. I don't think Lucas is the problem. I think the problem really is timing more than anything. So let's go on to the next section, which is about, Star Wars at this point and the potential of Star Wars fatigue. So again, people tend to forget that when Star Wars 7 came out, or was coming out, there was a lot of hype, a lot of buzz, a lot of that, hey, maybe we can get a new Star Wars that won't have all the problems that Lucas brought to the table, because now he's, out of touch with it and making this garbage, which wasn't garbage, but, there are always going to be those people who thought that. Well, Disney comes out with their first movie. Now, the one thing I will say, and somebody who I think was a bad choice, was J.J. Abrams. I don't hate J.J. Abrams, and again, Episode 7 was fine, but the decision that Abrams was put involved had a couple of ramifications. One is, J.J. Abrams is obsessed with mystery stories, this mystery box mentality, and we've seen this in other films he's done. When he did the Star Trek trilogy, and he insisted consistently that, no, it's not Khan, it's not Khan, it's not Khan, his name is John Harrison. Star Trek 2 had Khan. Okay, fine, it was Khan. Just he does this, and this is one of the things that really became a problem in the first movie. We have Rey, and again, I know a lot of people hated Rey for being a girl and for being a quote-unquote Mary Sue, but between episodes 7 and 8, we had this massive time frame where fans were constantly coming up with theories. Is she actually a Kenobi? Is Rey a Skywalker? Maybe she's Luke's long-lost kid? Something. Well, it was stated early on by Abrams, he was going to make this first movie and move on. And the first movie, he even admitted he wanted the film to be very familiar. It follows a lot of the same beats, We're on the hunt for Luke Skywalker, just the same way that, we were on the hunt for the plans to the Death Star. There was something, we have Han as kind of the old mentor to young Rey and Finn, but the plot beats seem very similar. This is where, Abrams also could set up all these mysteries and then walk away, which is, again, what he likes to do. He likes to set up mysteries and then not have to be the one who solves them. I would often argue that George Lucas's biggest gift is building these throwaway lines and backgrounds into his films, especially Star Wars, that make you think. Like, General Kenobi, you served my father in the Clone Wars. Great. Now he's got to build the Clone Wars later. Well, Abrams' big thing is, again, creating these weird mysteries and then, if possible, walking out before someone else has to solve them. And the early strategy they talked about with this movie was going to be, or this trilogy, was going to be that Abrams would make the first movie and make it basically this warm, comfy blanket to get fans, lulled into that sense before we make any big changes. And big changes they made. They brought in Rian Johnson for the next movie, and Rian, honestly, I think that he gets a lot more hate than he deserves. But again, he was tasked with making a different movie, and he had a lot of good ideas that, again, were going to force fans to think, to try to move off beyond what they'd seen before, to stay out of this cloak of nostalgia and mysteries. And he spoiled a lot of mysteries. Rey wasn't somebody special. Well, and again, this caused a lot of fan disdain. It caused a lot of fan hate. I've heard many people say that Episode 8 was the worst thing ever, and that Rian Johnson should be fired, killed, etc. But again, then you see, other movies he's done, like Glass Onion, and it's like, he's actually a really good director and a good creative, but he was in this position. And this is what was expected. Now, again, fans made their voices heard, and Disney brought back J.J. Abrams, who turned the last film into a nostalgia fest. I mean, really, that's what it was. And I'm not saying it was a terrible film either. None of these films are the worst thing ever. Trust me, I can find you worse movies. If you want me to come up with a list of movies that are worse than Star Wars, movies that you won't want to sit through, I can do that. Hell, Mystery Science Theater's done that. Watch Cool as Ice. Good example. But instead, we have, these movies that don't make the expectations. And, of course, the side projects. This is the other thing. Disney has had a lot of side projects. And they've really run the gamut, from good to bad. But none of them are unwatchably bad. We've had things like Ahsoka, we've had Obi-Wan, we've had, can't think of the one now, but, the Solo, A Star Wars Story, Rogue One, lots of good stuff at the same time. Andor, that was the one I was trying to think of. At the same time, these projects are going to show you the larger side of the universe, which is another thing to consider. At this point, Star Wars is huge as a universe. And that largeness, that scale, means that we can tell different stories in the same universe. Some things can be wacky comedy. Some things can be slow burn espionage. I mean, Andor is definitely not as high action as, say, the first Star Wars movie, or Solo even. This was a series that was built on telling a spy story, a birth of a rebellion kind of story, but it's not going to have the action. And that's really where, we've come to, and we've kind of come full circle. We're now dealing with the fact that we've created a franchise, a universe, and everyone wants to play in it. It's not going to be everything is good, because we have a lot of people, in the stew, as it were. You're still going to get good stories, I think, and you're still going to have great ideas. But ultimately, this many people and this amount of time, what's really been created in Star Wars is a universe. A universe that's going to have good stories, less good stories, and some filler. I'm sorry, but it's true. But its success is also where it fails for that very reason. Like I said before, and I think the real crux of this is, we've grown as people. The saga has grown from one crazy movie that Lucas himself said, if he was lucky, would be the kind of thing that you might remember at a Star Trek convention. They might have a booth at a Star Trek convention being their sign of success, to, literally being everywhere, being a breakfast cereal, being a toy line, being, people even accepting Jedi as a religion. So that's really, I think, where the problem, if any, has lied. It's because of the fact that our expectations evolve, as do the stories. We're at a point now where, a Star Wars story is almost like a Western, or any other kind of film, a World War II film. You're going to have, setting it in that doesn't necessarily guarantee any mark of quality, but it also doesn't guarantee any mark of terrible either. It doesn't mean, oh, well, it's going to be, it's going to be terrible because it's a Star Wars film. No. Ultimately, though, it is a genre in and of itself. It is its own encapsulated world, and, despite some specific rules and some things, that you should expect when walking into any new Star Wars movie or project, it is what it is at this point. It is a franchise, and it is going to keep going. Even if, Disney stops production right now on everything they're doing, it's going to come back eventually, if nothing else, for nostalgia. and this is something else that again has changed in the scope of this media, is we no longer deal with things as single products. We don't have movies that are just one and done. We look at, or studios look at franchises, partially out of greed, partially out of that desire to have a continued audience, but it's going to happen. And honestly, I'm okay with Star Wars. I don't think that it's been destroyed or ruined the way that some people have often said, because it is what it is. It is a huge saga, and at this point, it's only going to get bigger. There's only going to be more product, and honestly, I think attacking the creators, attacking the actors and actresses is beyond stupid. We've seen way too many of these actors who have, been attacked to the point that they leave social media or even attempt suicide, as Ahmed Best did. And I think that the fans who are the toxic ones, the ones that are, taking this, I don't like this, so far as to, attack actors, attack creatives, there's where the other problem lies. It's going to happen. It's happened before. It will happen again in other franchises. But in the end, that's the only problem I can see with Star Wars is we've grown, it's grown, and maybe not together. So that's my thoughts. Again, feel free to roast me in the comments. I'm sure many of you will. But for those of you who've taken the time to listen, I thank you, and may the Force be with you.